product of the Allied forces. Built to provide a free world in rapid time, they were the USA's biggest contribution to the UK's steam locomotive fleet.
In World War II, each side chose a goods locomotive for mass production. Germany gave us the Kriegslocks, Britain gave us the WDs, and the Americans gave us these, the S160s. They were built between 1942 and 46 by Alco, Baldwin and Lima, who were usually works that were at war with each other. So how many did they make? 50? 95? No. Official records indicate over 2,100.
The design was the brainwave of Major J.W. Marsh of the Corps of Engineers. They were based on the S159s from the 1930s, with bar frames, 4-foot 9-inch cast steel driving wheels, and a boiler pressure of 225 psi. And when you combine this with 19 by 26-inch cylinders, Walschaerts valve gear, and a firebox hotter than a Rita Hayworth pin-up, then you get a tractive effort of 31,410 pounds. At 61 feet and 124 tons overall, these engines were fairly small by American standards, but if they were going to fit within the British loading gauge, they had to be. You can still tell this is American from a mile away, with the tiny smokebox door, all the exposed pipes and that massive air pump. A British engineer would normally hide this stuff away, but because this was wartime, it was easier to have everything exposed for all to reach. It's all pretty bog standard stuff. Even the name sounds a bit utilitarian.
In theory, they were classified S160 by the USATC, but in reality, the USATC was formed after the first of these engines were built, and American classification was a bit more basic than that. You see, the engines were superheated, hence the S, and they weighed 160,000 pounds, hence the 160. Now, compared to Big Boy and Challenger, it is a rubbish name, let's face it. But catchy names are for marketing wars, not real ones, where real lives are in real danger.
Railways may have been useless as weapons, but they proved vital in transporting supplies, and World War II proved this more than ever before. In 1939 alone, Britain's railways transported more than 254 million tonnes of goods, running over 133 million journey miles across a network exceeding 19,000 miles of track. In America, gasoline rationing meant the only way to move troops, ammunition and supplies overland was by rail. And in Europe, the French and German rail networks were constant targets for Allied airstrikes. The S160s were just a drop in the military ocean. So where did these 2,000 or so engines go? Alco and Baldwin completed the first engines in September 1942. A minority remained in the USA. 200 were built to 5-foot gauge for work in Russia, and 60 were built to 5-foot 6-inch gauge for work in India. But the British dispatch was perhaps the biggest. Over 400 were pressed into service across the Big Four, with another 400 stored at Ebbw Junction in South Wales as a strategic reserve. Allied attacks on German-occupied France included sabotaging their railways and rolling stock, and when the time came for the Allies to invade, the army would need replacements. The idea was that when the D-Day landings took place, here was a fleet of basic, powerful engines ready and waiting to go. Now how's that for forward thinking? An unusual sight for British fitters was the suspension. The front pair of driving axles were sprung independently from the rear pair. This idea, combined with the bar frames, was supposed to give the locomotives a much smoother ride over rough track. In terms of power, the S160s were lagging behind some of their British contemporaries. The Hungarian state railways may have permitted their S160s to pull 2,245 tons, but that was strictly on the level while limited to 18 miles an hour. Great Western crews would tell you the 2800s could easily outpull the fat Yanks. But on the other hand, a 2800 doesn't sound as awesome as this. Let's hear that again, shall we? Oh, that's such a good sound. They also influenced British designers to incorporate many labour-saving features. Remember how the BR standards usually came with a rocking grate, self-cleaning smoke boxes, and running plate and cabs attached to the boiler instead of the frames? Well, all of those, admittedly, were features on these engines. They even had the steam engine's equivalent of a suicide pill. There once was a drain cock located in the corner of the cab which could be opened to let all the sludge out of the boiler, but couldn't be closed again, forcing the boiler to run dry. This was to prevent the Germans from making use of them should they fall into enemy hands, though as we'll find out soon, this wasn't really needed. So, did G.I. Joe storm in and save Tommy Atkins without breaking a sweat? Oh boy, where do I begin?
When the MP for Abingdon asked the British House of Commons if these engines were ready for immediate use, he got the reply, they shall be under steam within a few days of their arrival. But little did anyone realise that all of these engines had to go through the works for fitting of lamp irons, pistons and handbrakes before any of them could turn a wheel. And that was before they discovered that the braking system on these engines didn't work.
This was due to the brake cylinder being positioned too far from the driver's brake valve. Modifications were made, but even after that, some people considered the braking system weak. And a few other issues came up early on. The flanges on the tyres were too tight to run on British track, so 3/8 of an inch had to be skimmed off. This would cause them to pick points when going backwards. They had grease lubricators instead of mechanical oil ones, so the axle boxes would constantly run hot, which didn't help when some of the bearings were made of the same hard metal as the rods, rendering them useless. But the biggest issue with these engines was the water gauge in the cab.
You see, unlike these glasses, which have got levers, top and bottom, there was a single screw drain at the bottom of the glass, and if the fireman didn't close that properly when he was reading the levels, then there was a danger of it giving a false indication. So over a period of time, there was a risk of the inner firebox weakening and then allowing the crown to cave in on itself without warning.
In layman's terms, if the water level was lower than the gauge was showing, then the boiler could explode. And guess what? 3 of these engines blew up in the space of 10 months, having clocked up barely 50,000 miles between them. So it seems if you want to prevent one of these engines falling into enemy hands, you don't need that suicide drain cock. Still, with careful judgment, sufficient maintenance and a handful of modifications, the majority of these engines managed to carry on without a hitch. But, like every wartime engine, they weren't designed to last forever. by D-Day, nearly all of the UK-based S160s were dispatched as part of the invasion, and by 1946 there was only one of these engines left in Britain, until this was scrapped in 1957. Those who survived the war ended up going to faraway lands, including China, Peru, India, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, North and South Korea, to name but a few. Poland and Hungary took 500 of these engines each, and eventually the S160s could be found in 23 countries worldwide. They were only built to last a few years, but by the start of the 21st century, 25 were believed to still exist, with 8 of them once again in the UK. Take this one for example. Exported to China in 1946, number 5197 found her way to the UK in 1995. She returned to steam at the Llangollen Railway 3 years later, and ever since, the engine has toured many heritage lines around the UK. One of them was nearly broken up as soon as it was preserved. When withdrawn from service in Hungary, number 6046 was the victim of a breakdown in communication and sent for scrap. Luckily, a UK enthusiast was able to snatch her up in the nick of time, and so brought her to Tyseley for restoration. Eventually, the restoration moved to Cheddleton in Staffordshire, and in 2012, the engine was back in service on the Churnit Valley Railway. But perhaps the most famous S160 in the UK is this one. Number 5820 spent her post-war career with the Polish State Railways. By the 1970s, Polish steam was beginning to decline, while in the UK, steam preservation was well underway. So, at a time when a fully operational engine could be imported on the cheap, this one was brought to the Keighley and Worth Valley Railway in November 1977. And ever since, Big Jim has played a big part in the Worth Valley's new lease of life. So, the number of survivors, or rather, the miracle of survivors. Just how did these short-term investments last so long?
Somebody once said to me the S160s were disposable junk, and it's only because of English dedication, Welsh resourcefulness, and Scottish stubbornness that any of them are still going at all. Was he right?
Well, on the surface, it may seem that way, but it's not entirely fair. You see, here in the UK, we don't have the best history with American locos. Apart from a handful of one-offs and batches, the majority of them have been wartime austerity designs that were brought to the UK on a temporary or second-hand basis. Oh sure, most of them are very powerful, and to be fair, some of them did find a new use on British soil. But on the whole, they all had the same issues. Built on the cheap, crude, cumbersome, ungainly, uneconomic, unreliable, and basically stifled by their wartime requirements. And that's a great shame, because to be fair to the Americans, they can build a good locomotive. Their global exports have been far greater than those of our own. They even make most of our locomotives today. So, because you can't avoid saying this in a review on American Locos, here's my 2 cents on the S160s.
Because there were so many of these things built, if one suffered a blown cylinder or needed a new boiler, then there were plenty waiting in the wings to become donor machines. It's the classic case of Trigger's broom. Now, okay, it's not the best principle in the world. I mean, it does beg the whole question of, is this original? And that sort of thing. But it has ensured the survival of so many machines for such a long period of time. Not just steam engines, but cars, buses, tractors, boats, lots of things. And with the S160s, it has at least worked in their favour. A bit like the Minis, or the austerities, and that sort of thing.
To sum up then, the S160s were not the engines that won the war. Compared to their homeland contemporaries, they were smaller than was needed at the time. And in Britain, they proved more of a liability. But, as a stopgap for global steam, they found a new purpose. As one of the most mass-produced wartime locos in history, it's fair to assume they carried on where destroyed engines left off. They were the most unlikely engines to have stood the test of time. To quote an American hero, even the losers get lucky sometimes.